Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
Hi, it's Zoe. And did you know that creativity and mental health go hand in hand? And that we've got a bit of work to do when it comes to designing workplaces and systems that encourage both. My guest today is Mark Simmonds. He is a creativity, insight, and innovation and mental health expert. He comes all the way from the United Kingdom. He's got 20 years and more of working in big corporates, places like Unilever, Tesco, Telefonica, Pernod Ricard, Philips, and Bayer. He has worked extensively in creativity and insight and innovation. He's been a creativity and management trainer, so he loves the creative stuff. And in our conversation today, we talk explicitly about some of the strategies to develop creativity, including applying the flow cycle and our natural circadian rhythms to bring out the best of our creativity and productivity, and move into the mental health space, where he talks about his own personal experience, both as a sufferer of anxiety and stress and a mental health issues, as well as having a daughter for whom he was carer for a while, who had her own mental health issues. And between these two conversations, we find an overlap and how we can set up workplaces to both stimulate creativity and manage mental health. Let's get into it. Fantastic. All the way from the UK, we have Mark Simmonds on the show today. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Zoe. Thank you. Good to be here.
We were just comparing notes how difficult it is to manage time zones, especially between Australia and the UK, because we're kind of more or less 12 hours apart. So that can be challenging. So I appreciate you staying up late on your side to be here. It's not so early here, so that's okay. Cool. Now, you've got such an interesting series of arrows to string to your bow. I'm not even sure that's the right metaphor, but we'll go with it. And I want to tackle the creativity and innovation side of your profession first up, because I think it's incredibly useful and topical for the CEOs that listen into this podcast. So I'm curious about how do you end up becoming a creativity expert?
Okay, so let's try to keep it quite short and sharp. So my background has been, I'm a serial management trainer. So I've been in the teaching profession, working with big corporations for most of my career. Okay, and I used to work, in fact, for Unilever, one of the biggest sort of companies in the fast-moving consumer goods sector. But I kind of found my passion, which was in training and sort of coaching, when I was relatively early in my career. And I've kind of started to focus, as you get a bit older, you sort of decide, well, which is the particular bit of management training that really you enjoy the most. And I just kind of quite like the creativity side. So I'm quite a sort of free thinker, and I enjoy it. And I also found that in companies are often very, very strong in terms of having lots of internal processes. So most corporations, have lots of procedures, bureaucracy, techniques, but what they often lack is a sense of kind of the creative side of things. So I kind of sort of found with a colleague a gap a few years back where we started to say, well, look, what about the creativity side to business? Isn't that missing a little bit? And what we found in the last 2 or 3 years is that that's become more and more important. And I think particularly in sort of COVID times, I think leaders are now seeing that if they want to sort of see a way through COVID and beyond, then we've got to be a little bit more than simply sort of rational, logical human beings. So I kind of think that my passion for creativity has always been there, but the need now seems to be there sort of amongst the population. That makes sense.
As a creative, as an outlet, as a way of feeling fulfilled. Is that what you mean? There's a need out there?
Yeah, so just to be clear, so what it is that when I work for the big corporations, I mean, the companies like Unilever and GlaxoSmithKline, is that they are tasked with developing new products, new innovations. Okay, so
Okay.
their lifeblood is developing new stuff. In order to do that, the people that they employ need to be creative. They've got to sort of be creatively quite confident. But the irony is that even though those big companies are charged with developing lots of new ideas and that's their lifeblood, often when you ask a group of people in a training course, okay, hands up here, who thinks they're creative? You get a really poor show of hands. So even though there's a real clear need for it in the workplace, people don't feel that they're that creative. So what I do as my job is I try to help unlock people's creative confidence so that they can then develop new ideas for their companies. That's my skill, really. That's what my company does. So, for example, that you use the skill to develop new concepts, to sort of do more brainstorming, to give people the belief that they are creative and that it's not simply the role of, for example, the advertising agencies alone to be the creative ones. Yeah, so I think that's what I'm trying to do, is try to basically leverage every single ounce of creativity in every single individual. It sounds a little bit sort of pompous, but it's a bit of like a mission to get the most creative juice out of everybody.
Yeah, I love it. That's so fun. And I think one of the misnomers, from what I understand of creativity, is that people think it's you just sit there with a blank canvas and pluck something from the sky, whereas the reality is it's about having containers and frameworks to work within that. The constraints can sometimes liberate ideas. Is that your
Yeah,
experience and your
it's a nice idea. It's nice for saying it actually, because actually often it's much easier to be creative within a constraint. So if people are kind of sort of some boundaries to work within, then they can be more creative. And actually, it's creative is not simply about sitting down there, as you say, with a blank piece of paper. Let's come up with some ideas. So that even, I'm now looking at my computer right now, and if I've got a particular problem, I can go into Google Images, I can tap into the search bar, the problem, the phrase, and for 10 minutes, I can get access to a whole bunch of stimulus and inspiration that I can then use to be creative. So creative is not about necessarily you being the person to generate. It could be about you kind of spotting what's good and what's out there. So, one type of creativity is certainly the kind of people that always have great ideas, are always thinking about things there, but that's not the only kind of creativity that's out there. So I try to kind of unlock whatever there is within people.
I like this idea of seeking stimulus, and I think it's somewhere in some of your material, or maybe it's your profile. You talk about combinatory play. I'm not even sure that's pronounced that correctly. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's not mine, by the way. I mean, that's it's a lovely little sort of philosophy that I absolutely swear by. So if I can explain what it is, so combinatorial play or combinatorial creativity, even I've got to sort of to spit it out, is something that came from Albert Einstein. Okay, and in a nutshell, what it is basically that his belief was that it's by trying to combine disparate things that when they collide, you then come up with creative thinking. So, for example, he was obviously a brilliant mathematician, a brilliant physicist. But when he got his ideas is when he sort of put down the problems, took up his violin or his piano, started playing, and then just relaxed and didn't think about anything other than playing the violin. And then by doing those things collided and then sort of out popped an idea or so. Doesn't sound like as nebulous as it sounds, because there's a biological reason for what's happening here. Because you are only creative when your brain feels relaxed. So ironically, that the one place that is not great for creativity is in the workplace, because what's really bad for creativity is stress and anxiety. So what he's kind of saying is that you've got to find a space within which you can be completely relaxed, because it's when your brain is relaxed that you are at your most generative. So again, it's not that well known, but the time of day when you're at your most productive is when you are asleep, because the brain at that point has simply got time and space not to think about the day to day, and the subconscious is kind of there whirring away at all the thoughts that have been plotted in your head. So if you basically spend your day doing a number of different things, playing the violin, going for a walk, going for a swim, doing a bit of work, those things then create collisions that come to the fore during the middle of the night. So that the thing about, I mean, everyone's heard about, I had a thought in the shower in the morning. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's kind of common knowledge. You had a thought in the shower, and you think, well, yeah, but you don't really, do you? But you do, you do. The reason why is because when you're in the morning time, you've had a lovely night's sleep. Your mind is not full of the rubbish of the day yet. It's simply open to stuff here. So that's the point at which the brain releases all the stuff that's been playing around overnight, and that's when the ideas kind of come out here. So it's something that I just passionately believe to be the case. And why it's so important is because imagine this. I've been training in big corporations for about 30 years, and I've just realized that the one place where you are not creative is in the workplace. So it's like I feel like I've been a fraud for 30 years, not telling people that we're wasting our time trying to be creative in the workplace. And that's why, so ironically, I know that we've had it really bad in the UK, like in most places in the world. But when COVID hit, and all of a sudden everybody was forced to work at home, I suddenly thought this would be a great silver lining, because I knew that creativity wasn't working in the workplace. So when people are working at home, there was all of a sudden this great opportunity to try to be a bit more relaxed and let your creative juices flow. And the unfortunate thing, though, is that a lot of the big corporates, when their employees were working from home, you would have hoped they would have just let them have some time to kind of do the fun stuff. But unfortunately, I think what a lot of corporates have done is they back it up with Zoom to Zoom, back-to-back calls, and it's no better than being in the office, really. In theory, you're at your best when you're at your most relaxed, and generally that's not at work.
That's really fascinating. So this whole creative surge was poised for an acceleration and then stymied by the Zoom doom.
Well, maybe. I think it's too early to tell right now, sorry, because I think that what will happen is that, again, the big debate right now, certainly in the UK, is, has lockdown been good for people's creativity? Has it been good for their productivity? And there's two lines of thinking here. There's the people who say, no, we must get back to work. They're the people that think, no, we must stay at home. But I think where we'll settle will be in this kind of hybrid territory, which I think would be great. A kind of a 3-2 model or a 2-3 model, 3 days at work, 2 days at home. And then kind of with that, I think we've got a better chance of having that kind of creativity surge that you talked about.
I agree with that. And the research that I've been coming across with regards to is work from home good depends on where you sit in your life stage, whether it's been good for you or not. So the people who did not like it the most and struggled with it the most were younger generations, so people in their early 20s who have not yet established their own permanent household and family, and were relying on the social connection of the workplace to stimulate them and for their bonds of connection, and working moms. So working mothers were often the ones who just had no break. So they still maintained their usual workload at home and tried to educate kids and tried to get work done. So those two groups struggled the most through this whole situation. So I think there's not a broad brush, it's good or it's bad. It depends very much on people's individual circumstances.
I think, yes, and we got 3 older kids who are in their mid-20s who are in that first bracket that you're talking about there. So
yeah,
they're kind of itching to get back into kind of some kind of more social kind of environment, both with their friends, but also the professional context.
Yeah. I was curious about, as you're describing the brain and creativity, have you done much research around the flow cycles and how that affects creativity?
The flow cycles, by that you mean what? So to be clear.
Csikszentmihalyi's theory of flow, and then building on that, some of the research that Stephen Kotler has summarized in some of his work about the different phases of getting into flow, which is your peak creativity and productivity stage, where when peak of flow, when your brain is saturated with dopamine, neuroepinephrine, and adenamide, which is about being able to connect patterns. So some of the creativity stuff you're talking about, like the combinatorial play, is probably when your brain is flooded with anandamide and you're able to see patterns and make connections, that kind of stuff.
No, it's faster because I'm making notes of all these things that I'm going to research when I put the phone down. But I tell you what's interesting. I've got a kind of DIY version of what you're talking about here, because again, I've been working from home for many years. I'm an independent person who works from home. I mean, pre-COVID, this is where I enjoy working. And what I found is that I kind of started producing a YouTube channel with my younger son to help people in lockdown. Okay, so people not used to being locked down. So I thought, well, what do I do? What do I do at home? I mean, and the YouTube channel was about giving people some basics around structuring your day. It's a fairly straightforward sort of 101 about how to get through a day. But then I kind of thought, okay, what about going one step further? And how do we try to maximize our creativity throughout the day? Okay. And then I kind of think about, okay, what about a concept around sort of like moving with your mood? Moving with your mood. Now, this is not based on the science here, but it's just based upon how I operate best of all. So we talked before the call about when are we both at our best? And I'm at my absolute best, my most efficient productively from about 7 o'clock in the morning till about 11 o'clock in the morning. So what I do is I come into my office, and for me, that time is what I call sort of like efficiency tick list time, if that kind of makes sense. So you're there, and I'm just rattling through my tick list because I'm feeling super efficient. My brain is really sharp, and I get things done. But then I get to about 11 o'clock, and I start to slowly fade a bit. And we then, because we're living in the house and there's four of us, we kind of then go to our Starbucks, if that makes sense. And we call it it's our kitchen, but it's in the same kind of way. So there's some research I read recently about the kitchen being a great place to stimulate your brain to be creative. Because if you think
Really?
yeah. Because if you think about a Starbucks or like a Costa or any coffee shop, I don't know about you, but I often, when I'm in London, would pop into a Costa or a Starbucks because there's a bit of buzz, there's a bit of sort of, noise, but no one's talking to you. And you can sit there and you can gaze and you can look around you and you can basically pick out the stimulus here, but you can be quite productive in a creative kind of way. So it's not a place to concentrate on important stuff, but it's a space to generate. So what we do at home is that we kind of have a bit of a joke within the family. We have a kind of our Costa kitchen, and we go there. We have kind of like 20 minutes, morning, the afternoon. It's free to talk, to chat, and take some post-it notepads, and it's just a place to generate, to talk, to chat. So for me, that's a kind of a late morning, late afternoon slot. But I discovered this wonderful invention. I'm exaggerating slightly here, but post lunch, at about 2:30, my brain is like absolutely on its knees, if I can just mix my metaphors. And I can't go on. So I discovered the joy of just simply giving in and taking a nap. And every single day, I mean, weekends as well, I take a nap. And as far as my family members are concerned, I'm having an internal meeting.
Right.
It helps just, but the biology here of it is that you're simply trying to meet the needs of your body's circadian rhythm, is the term, where it just needs a rest. And so rather than fight through that graveyard slot, I sit down in my little home office. I've got this little two-seater sofa. I close the door, and for half an hour, I'm literally, it's eye shut. Then I wake up, and I can just go. I can literally go for a couple of hours. I'm kind of relatively speaking on fire for a couple of hours. So, and again, going to the back end of the day. So it's now in the UK, it's about 9 p.m., 9:30 in the evening. And so in about an hour, I'll be heading upstairs, and I'll be having about 15 minutes of just wonderful me time. I mean, crude at all, but I'll be having a nice hot bath, radio on, book. And for me, it's a time when I'm preparing myself for the night, because that's when Einstein's combinatorial play will work. So it's not as scientific as what you were talking about, Zoe, but it's the same principle. Just understand the flow of where your brain's at and where your body's at and meeting its needs.
I think what you find is that when you Google Stephen Kotler's cycle, like flow cycles, it'll map exactly against what you're intuitively doing. So the flow cycles are struggle. So struggle is the phase one, which is when you're doing hard stuff and you're working out problems. and your brain has got dopamine and norepinephrine and it's hard. And then you take a break, which is like your coffee in the kitchen is that. You take a break, you do something else, you go for a walk, you purge those stress chemicals, and then that primes you for the creative stuff, which is, so you go struggle, release, which is do something different and etc. And then the third part of it is flow, which is when you get at your most creative and you're pumping out ideas and all that kind of stuff, and your body is flooded with all sorts of neurochemicals, like a huge bucket load of feel-good things. And then it's exhausting, so you need to have recovery time, which is your bath time.
For sure. And I think there's within that, there's the obvious thing which I've missed out upon, is that kind of good 1 hour's exercise, because that's the other thing which just releases all kinds of endorphins and all sorts of good stuff here. So, but I'm a convert to this, not just for the creativity side, but I know that we might well talk about the mental health side as well, because it's just there to help not just keep me creative, but just to keep me sane as well. So the two things are quite closely aligned, the sort of the sanity and the creativity, they're not that far apart as concepts.
Well, I think let's move in and talk about that, because the theme for this quarter is all about developing other leaders, and developing creativity is a key aspect of developing leadership. And if we can bring out every ounce, as you say, of people's creativity, that's in service to developing others. And hand in hand goes the mental health piece. And you've written a book about that. So if we're going to be talking about developing other leaders, how would you go about the mental health side of things? Like, what's your key insight and advice around helping people develop their mental health?
Okay, there's two things here. Are we talking therefore about leaders and how they can sort of help manage their team's mental health, or is it about individuals' own mental health? Because I think they're two slightly separate things.
Well, let's talk about both of those. Let's start with the individual. So the individual managing their own mental health, and then advice to leaders on helping them deal with their team's mental health.
Okay, great.
Individuals first.
That's fine. So again, this comes from bitter experience, because there's my little sort of hobby horse, my little side hustle is in the mental health area, born out of experience. Because when I was in my sort of late 30s, I had a bad nervous breakdown caused by stress at work, and it was a pivotal time in my life because it just made me think about a lot. So I think that ironically, my strong belief is that there is one thing to get right in your life to help you with your mental health. And it sounds really obvious, and it sounds really sort of, it's just to find the right job. Nothing else matters, because I think often, what we end up doing is that we don't end up really understanding what we're all about and the environment that we're going into. So for example, I'm quite an introvert by nature, which is why lockdown's not been so difficult for me, because it's not been tricky being on my own. But when I kicked off my career, I ended up working in companies that demanded extroverts. It was much more so when you find yourself like an introvert in an extroverted environment, the two things are not really going side by side. And I also ended up finding myself in a job which is all about getting things done, tasks, budgets, goals. And I'm a kind of a trainer. And for me, I should have been a teacher. I should have been a teacher. My parents said I should have been a teacher. So I ended up in a task-oriented role when I should have been in a people-focused role. So I think if you just imagine, you just get your basics right, if you're in the right job for the right reasons, for the right person that you are, then you're going to be in a really great place not to get into bad mental health issues. And if you did that, you could almost end the story. No need for anything else there, because it's all got to work out. And then once you get into the right kind of job, it can still go wrong. It can still go wrong. So, in my particular case, because I love my job so much, and I it was like a weekend, Sundays. You work on Sundays because you want to get on and get that. So a whole bunch of other stuff starts to happen, where you suddenly start to kind of go off the rails because you're not looking after yourself. I had a sort of a therapist who said, look, the really key thing for mental health is to make sure that you've got your banisters in place. And there's a kind of a lovely analogy. So look, in life, the staircase can often be a bit rickety, but as long as you've got your banisters in place, then you'll be okay. And so by that, what she meant was, look, okay, simply, are you exercising? Are you eating? Are you socializing? Are you sleeping well? All these things with your banisters in place, and they will keep you in the straight and narrow. Because the staircase will always be rickety. But if your banisters are in place and you're in the right job, you've got a much better chance of kind of getting through life without having any big blips.
That sounds like very substantial advice. So the banisters being eating, sleeping, exercising, socializing. Were there any other ones?
No, I mean, to be fair, I mean, it is worth saying that some people are more prone to depression or anxiety. So there's the age-old thing about, look, what's medication like? So in my case, for much of my adult career, I've been on sort of some fairly light medications. There'd be a banister. So it's like, for me, it's a case that's what I need to keep me on the straight and narrow. So I've got no issues about that there. For other people, it would be more about talking therapies. So there's, the meditation, the mindfulness, the CBT. So it's just a kind of little armory of things that you're going to have by your side. And I think the other thing to have is I'm very blessed with having a lovely wife, Mel. And Mel is normal. She's normal because she doesn't really have any predisposition to mental ill health. Nothing runs in the family. So she's just really rational. And if you're someone that's prone to stress or anxiety or depression, and you're lucky enough to have a partner who's not, then their role is kind of like a sort of almost a stress or a mental health police person. They're kind of the people there that are going to be your early warning system. So when I had my bad breakdown many years ago, we kind of made a kind of contract between us to say, look, if I start not laughing, if I start not socializing, if I start biting my nails, it's all these little things there. You must please let me know this. So I think particularly now in the current situation, I think it's really important that you can spot the warning signs. So for example, if somebody is acting out of character with how they usually are, the person best placed to spot that is going to be their partner or a close person to them. Okay, so the first thing, are they acting against the norm? That's the first of all. The second thing is kind of trying to say, okay, but when they're doing that, are you going to ask them the question, like, Zoe, you're not yourself today, are you okay? And Zoe might say, actually, I'm fine. But will you then be able to ask the question again, knowing they're not fine? So you're still not yourself exactly. So it's having the bravery to always ask the second question, because often the second question where the kind of the floodgates open, if that makes sense. And that person won't be wanting to open up because it'd be such a difficult thing to say. But the second question often opens the gate. And I think then it's a question, and this is the second and the third thing, it's like when you're sort of dealing with people that have got sort of a mental illness, is that they then suddenly enter the world of irrational. And the world of irrational is different to the world of rational. So the world of rational is when something's wrong with someone, you give them advice on what to do this, do that, and it's all very good, very well and proper, but that's not what the person needs. They just need they need the language of irrational. They need the language of emotion. They need someone to say, look, I'm listening, I'm hearing you. They're empathetic, they're sympathetic, they're much more intuitive and much more listening rather than simply talking. So it's a kind of the key thing right now that with my wife that we're trying to sort of publicize is the importance of people closest to those who are suffering from mental health, because they're the ones that can often, in inverted commas, save a life, we think.
That's pretty powerful. So let me just check that I've understood this correctly. So there's red flags, and they'll be different for everyone, and it's usually to look out for, are they doing something that's out of character, not their normal pattern behavior? Then to ask twice, first to say, you're not your normal self, are you okay? And then to ask again, because the concern is still there, are you okay? And then not to jump in with practical advice, do this, do that, get your guardrails up. That presumably comes later. The first mental health first aid is to listen with empathy,
Yeah.
and to get the person to talk and unpack it. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct. And I think that the third one's important because it doesn't come naturally to most people. I mean, particularly men. I'm sorry to be sort of but you want to give a solution. Okay, so I'm not feeling well. We'll do this, do that, do this, and that's not what's needed. It's not what's needed. And it's funny because my wife Mel, she's a very rational person, and so when I was ill first time around, her temptation was to kind of to default to solutions. Okay, so you're stressed. Why don't you take off a few things off your to-do list? Why don't you, so it's the kind of thing, well, it was great advice, but she could have been speaking a foreign language. I wasn't listening. I didn't need that at the time there. So it's a difficult thing to do. And when my daughter, I mean, I don't want to throw too much into the mix, but my daughter Emily had a really bad period of anorexia and for many years. And with my wife and myself, we became her carers. And what was quite interesting was to see Mel becoming much, much more irrational in terms of how she dealt with Emily, having learned about how she dealt with me, so to speak. So I think it's something where it's trying to be able to speak two languages, because the language of rational is really quite important because it's quite practical, getting things done. But the language of irrational is as important because it's almost the one language that unlocks the person you're talking to.
And in doing that, can you get to the rational stage of putting up your mental health guardrails? When is there a tipping point where you go from the language of the irrational to let's do something to support you? Is that led by the person who's struggling, or is that led by the person prompting the conversation?
It's a good question. It's a good question. I mean, it's like what I want to be clear about, that it's not either or. I mean, it's just that the default is to jump straight into the language of rational and solve a problem. So it's almost like, can you bite your tongue and not talk? Whereas usually you want to talk. Now you're going to have to. So the key thing about in mental health is like you will need to, with your loved one, do something about it. So imagine that you're not well, you're going through a bad time. You can't purely rely upon the language of irrational and get nothing done. So the person needs some help. You need to proactively go and do something about it here. So what was fortunate with Mel and myself, as far as my daughter was concerned, was that when Emily was ill for many years, is that we kind of were able to play kind of the two languages, because Mel was always the rational one, and because of my illness, I kind of spoke the language of irrational. So it's a question of kind of knowing what to do when, because if you didn't have a kind of a rational person, I mean, Mel was fantastic with Emily of trying to simply manage her food routines and just get things done and go and sort out doctor's appointments. So it's not that one was more important than the other, but the one that's often understated is the language of irrational because it's the harder one. Yeah.
Why is it harder?
I think I mean, bizarrely enough, I tell you, if I can make a jump back to what we were talking about beforehand, creativity. Okay. Now this sounds a little bit like I'm going back to something, but for a good reason. Now, when we did a survey on creativity in the workplace in 2020, we looked at a period of 5 years to find out what kind of people were being recruited by companies. Okay. And we found that the vast majority of recruits, in terms of mindset, were of the logical, rational mindset rather than the emotional, creative mindset. So the actual kind of, it's kind of like saying that as we get older, we veer away from the more kind of creative, emotional side towards a more rational, logical, get things done kind of side here. So I just think it's almost a little bit knocked out of our system by the time that we get to kind of like, our 20s and 30s when we need it most. So you need it to be creative, but you need to be kind of a carer for people in need. So I think it's just something that as a human race would become a little bit more rational, more logical, less emotional and less creative.
Okay. So coming then to the part two, how as a leader do we encourage the conversation and the practice of mental health in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good one, isn't it? Because I think at the moment, unfortunately, is in the workplace, there's been great leaps in mental health generally in society. The last bastion or last job to be done is probably in the workplace, where it's still not, I don't think, not good enough as a thing. And I think that one of the reasons why is because a lot of companies, if you look at their kind of mission statements and their policies, everything's in place and they're kind of talking the talk, but not necessarily kind of walking the walk. So I think that partly, if you go back to the conversation we've just had, when I was really ill many years ago in the workplace, I was frightened of going to anybody in HR because I kind of thought it'd be sort of the death knell of my career. So if I go down HR, well, they're going to think you're weak, and it was competitive, so don't want to do that there. So I ummed and ahed and eventually told my boss, and I was just lucky. I was simply lucky. He just was the person that said, right, okay, I see what's happening here. Go and take a week off, a couple of weeks off and come back. My daughter, Emily, when she was working in London for ITV, was equally lucky. She was still very ill with her illness. And her boss just sensed something was wrong, realized that it was a mental illness, realized it wasn't life defining, in other words, or career limiting, and said, right, we've got a problem here. Now let's try to think about how we can resolve it. So in Emily's case, it was a question of trying to almost to sort of treat it as if Emily had broken her leg really badly and was just simply off work, okay? And that's what we're doing here. So I think it's kind of almost an attitude towards mental health to say, look, it is an illness like any physical illness, and it doesn't have to be career limiting. And unfortunately, there's still a bit of taboo around it. So if you are mentally unwell, you're not going to cut the mustard, are you? You're not going to make it. You're a liability. But going back to kind of like sort of, I mean, for me, I dipped out of corporate life early, and I found an environment which suited my personality. So imagine I'm quite a stress sufferer and I've had mental health issues. I had to find an environment where I could thrive, which was here at home. I don't think I could have thrived in a work environment in a corporate context there. I think partly because the mindset still is one of rational, logical, get things done, time pressure, and that just didn't suit me. So I do quite a lot of thinking around this whole introvert and extrovert dimension as well. So if you think about the workplace is fundamentally cut out for extroverts. It's an extrovert's paradise, isn't it? Really, let's be clear. So if companies could just think about, look, the fact that in their population of people, they're going to have 50% of the population will be probably introverts. So why can't we create an environment where introverts can thrive and survive? And again, it goes back to the creativity thing. I mean, J.K. Rowling, Albert Einstein, Charles Darwin were all massive introverts, okay? So there's a thinking, well, okay, but if you're not extrovert, if you're not noisy, if you're not loud, you can't be creative. It's just not true. So I think, again, if the workplace could be more kind of friendly towards both introverts and extroverts, that would help enormously trying to sort out kind of the mental health issues as well as the creativity issues there.
So if you're going to redesign workplaces to be more introvert friendly, what does that actually look like?
Well, it's kind of like saying, it goes back to the conversation we had about half an hour ago. So I think this whole opportunity we've got now to simply rethink about the working week. So step outside of the office for the time being. That whole 3-2 thing or the 4-1 thing. Imagine if you are a strong introvert and you can find out that now you've only got to spend 3 days in the hubbub of a social context at work and 2 days at home. That would be great, okay? But when it comes into the workplace itself, then it's a simply question of, there was the whole movement towards open plan offices and where you're just surrounded by humanity. So all you want to do is find a cubicle and go and hide yourself away because that's where you're at your best. And what's interesting also is that if you think about just the fabric of how companies work, if I get into my world of training, when you run a meeting or run a workshop, you get everyone together, 20 people together in a room, and the tendency is always to say, okay, let's have a big group discussion about things and what does the group think? And the poor introverts are there dying in a corner because all they want to do is just give me some time to think on my own. So even like if you're running a meeting as a leader and you're saying, look, okay, I'd like us all to spend 10 minutes saying nothing at all, take a pen and a pad and write down any thoughts you got there. Okay, it's really simple. The extroverts are loving it. The introverts are loving it rather. The extroverts get a little bit bored, but you're kind of playing to both needs here. So I think it's almost like going back to your first questions though. It's like saying, if as a leader, you want to try to get the most out of your people is trying to understand exactly what you've got in front of you. So introvert, extrovert. That guy there suffers from stress. Not a problem. He's probably great. It's just kind of knowing what you've got in the room to try to adapt the way in which you try to manage the people to their best of the abilities.
Fantastic. Mark, this has been extraordinary. What a wonderful conversation. I've learned heaps about mental health and the issues and how we can respond better and design workplaces and workplace practices that can support people. And I love talking about creativity and flow and how we can set ourselves up best to be creative. Whew, thank you so much for sharing your beautiful wisdom.
My pleasure. I love talking to you. Thank you so much for the time.
What a wonderful conversation. I just love Mark's energy and his insight. I love the conversation around creativity. I think it's super important personally to understand how to structure the workday based on circadian rhythms as well as the flow cycles, and designing practices and places where we can stimulate, what did he call it? Combinatorial play, as well as relaxation and recovery time. And that's super important on a day-to-day basis to encourage creativity and mental health. Some of the key takeaways that I'm getting from this conversation were around the mental health stuff and the importance of asking twice, are you okay? And to sit in the conversation with someone from an emotional, what he calls irrational place, and simply listen so the other person can be heard. Let them explore what's going on for them without wanting to dive in and offer solutions. And also at the same time to balance getting help for that person so they can help manage their own mental health recovery. So lots to unpack here. I hope you found it useful. And as a leader, I think there's plenty in this conversation for us to apply, managing our own mental health and creativity and facilitating the creativity and mental health of the people for whom we have accountability and responsibility, aka our staff. All right. Love to hear from you, what you found useful, interesting, and practical from this conversation. Feel free to send me an email, zoe@innercompass.com.au, or rate and review the podcast. Always a winner in my book in terms of gaining good karma points and boosting the profile of this podcast so we can keep bringing you fantastic interviewees and insights like the interview we had today with Mark. What else? Well, I just want to say thank you. Thank you for listening and thank you for supporting the show. It makes turning up every week worthwhile. So in the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.